Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Peter Robinson, and this is your Ethereum Engineering Group meetup. Today, we've got James, who's come along and going to tell us all about crypto economics and design for games. So, James, do you want to introduce yourself a bit before you dive into the slides?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm James. I am from Brisbane, Australia, just like Peter. And I have been working in the games industry for about 10 years now. I started off as an engineer and moved into sort of product management and design over the years. I've been working in a company called Immutable for the last nearly 3 years at this point in time, specializing in Web3 game economies. So a lot of the work that I do is not just for our internal products, though I do a lot of work for those. It's also for partner products building on the platform. So I advise on design, monetization strategy, and overall economic sustainability.
Okay, awesome. Awesome. So please, so when you're going through your slides, when do you want people to ask questions? Would you like them to maybe get to the end of a section, pause, let people ask questions then, or hold everything off until the end? What would you prefer?
So for me, I love getting interrupted. So if there's anything that pops into your mind that you want to ask, feel free to jump in at any point in time. I do have section breaks if you're more comfortable breaking in when I have a long pause. But I'm more than happy to take questions as I'm talking about things. If I do fail to get back on track, I apologize, but I'm generally pretty good at that.
Okay, fabulous. All right, well, please take it away.
Perfect. Let me just share my presentation. Perfect. Is that looking good for everyone?
Fantastic.
Perfect. So essentially what I'm going to go through today is diving into some of the high levels about my experience in Web3 game development. I've got a few key points here that I want to talk towards. So like, what is Web3 gaming? Why would you make Web3 games? And the complexity of it, is it integrating on-chain activity into your game? And then I'll talk through some example products using the two internal games that are developed at Immutable, Gods Unchained and Guild of Guardians. And then I'll talk about some of my future aspirations for the Web3 gaming space and what I think will evolve over time as we get a better understanding of how players can interact with these open economies that are available in Web3. So yeah, that's the agenda. Most of this presentation will be fairly light on the slides, and I'm just going to be riffing on a lot of different things. This is overall one of the areas of game development that excites me the most. So if I get a little bit sidetracked, forgive me, but ideally I'll be going towards a specific point. So without further ado, let's get started. So what is Web3 gaming as a concept? Ultimately, it can be any sort of game. I've got images. I've specifically selected these images to show you the breadth of products that currently exist in the Web3 space. You've got a game called Space Nation in the center right, which is a very complex economy, similar to games like EVE Online that you might have heard of, where players are exploring space, collecting resources, and actively trading. That seems like a pretty good fit for what Web3 games can be, but then you've got games like Eyeball Pool on the at the top right, which is a mobile pool game, and players are able to trade the pool cues that they acquire through gameplay. We've got Hunters on Chain in the bottom right, which is a character-based RPG game, multiplayer, and people are able to trade the characters that they acquire or the shards of characters they acquire to get new characters. And even so far as the center left, which is actually Baby Shark Universe, which is a game that's got a bunch of different aspects to it. It's a platformer. It's got some competitive combat elements as well. But as you can see from all of these, that there is a lot of diversity in the space. So I don't want anyone to come in into this talk thinking that Web3 games are just about the really complicated open economies that we've seen in a couple of examples in the Web2 space, such as EVE Online, as I mentioned earlier. RuneScape is a very common example. Games that require a lot of depth and a lot of user engagement over a long period of time. That is not necessarily what Web3 gaming is about. So to go into the points on the slide, what is Web3 gaming? Primarily, it's just the introduction of game mechanics that are backed by tradable assets. So it doesn't necessarily even mean that trading is a core part of the game experience, just that the assets are tradable, which inherently creates interesting experiences for the users. They do tend to have deeper, more complex economies as a result of this, but as I mentioned, a game like Baby Shark Universe, the economy of that game is not based on sort of the interactions that users have with one another within the economy. It's more so actually probably similar to a game like The Sims. The Sims is a really interesting example of something that could be developed in Web3 that is very separate to the traditional understanding of what Web3 gaming is. The Sims allows you to produce your own furniture, your own designs, your own clothing, and then distribute those to other users using their own game client launcher. This is essentially like how you mod The Sims. And Baby Shark Universe does something similar where you can acquire furniture and other resources and trade them to other players to decorate environments. It doesn't necessarily mean the economy is a core part of the game experience, but the ability to trade and mix and match and find a way to what's the word I'm looking for? A way to express yourself is actually what's core to that experience, and Web3 is something that can enable that. The other thing to keep in mind with Web3 is that it inherently creates multiplayer experiences. And I'm not talking about, for example, what you might see in Space Nation, where you're flying around and you see another user on the map who's doing something else while you're going and mining resources. The fact that there are elements of the product that are on-chain inherently means that you will have interactions with other users if you're engaging with that part of the product. Whether that is just simply buying an asset that's listed on the secondary market. That listing was created by another person, or potentially a bot, but usually another person. And that experience is something that can change your perception of the product that you're interacting with. And finally, the last point that I wanted to add here is that Web3 games are also naturally social experiences. You might have games that do drive social engagement. Thing that first popped into my mind was League of Legends. This is a game that requires strong coordination between players, teams of 5. There's so many elements to this game that drive social engagement. But the games in the Web3 space don't need to necessarily have those in-game mechanics that drive social experiences. The fact that these assets are on-chain, the fact that these assets are tradable, naturally tends the community towards engaging more socially. They'll discuss aspects of the secondary market activity. They'll look at what assets are in demand, what assets are not in demand. And a lot of this information that drives this social behavior is publicly available on the blockchain as well. That's what we see with a lot of our internal products at Immutable, is players actively talking and engaging with all these different parts of the experience. And we see that a lot more of our users are actively engaged with conversations in the Web3 space compared to what you'd see in a Web2 Discord server, as an example. So that's my high level of what Web3 gaming is as it stands. But why do I suggest people produce Web3 games? Or why would people want to produce Web3 games? And I think that the Web3 really does value add on top of the experiences that exist in Web2. I've got quite a long list here of things that Web2 gaming has problems with that aren't easily solvable right now that Web3 can assist with. For example, a lot of games monetize off of a very small group of users who spend a lot of money, meaning that games don't often see, especially in the free-to-play space, you have box products, which obviously sell a game for a set price, but they're not driving as much of the overall value of the games industry as free-to-play games are. And free-to-play games are games that are available to players for free, and we only generate value from a very small portion of users who are willing to invest a lot of money and time into the experience. In Web2 gaming, spend is entirely consumptive as well. This is something that we can add value for the audience and the players as opposed to the developers as much, but I'll get into the developer value later. But essentially, if a player buys something in a game, that is inherently consumptive, even if it's something that I can have on my account in the long term. So, for example, a cosmetic. It's something that I make the purchase and a state in my server has been changed, whether it be AWS, and Azure, whatever. My game state has been updated by this purchase, and that's it. I no longer have any value from that purchase. We also see in a lot of instances, even from what I'm hearing recently, even Fortnite is susceptible to this, which is accounts that have items that are no longer available, which is something that you use to drive user value. We want the player to feel special for being part of a special event or something that happened a while ago. These accounts are actually actively traded on the black market. And that is something that a lot of games that reach popularity will deal with. It's gone back for decades as well. Diablo 2 is an example that I reference often in my work, where players would engage in black market trades and you'd have another real user enter your Diablo 2 server and drop items on the floor in exchange for other resources, as well as paying for their service. The other thing is that there's very few games in the Web2 space that incentivize or encourage trading, because trading is really hard to make work. You've got all of the race conditions, you've got the user experience design. It's a really complex system to add to games, and most games don't do it because it's a large lift for something, so it has to be inherently important to the game experience. You'll see games like RuneScape as an example. Other MMOs implement features like this as well, where it adds a lot of user value and drives the social aspect of the game. But with Web3, we can kind of get that essentially for free, because that all occurs on chain without us needing to develop specific systems to enable that trading. And finally, in Web2, purchases occur in isolation in single instances of players, which is often prevents the social value of a purchase being shared widely amongst an audience. So what I've done here is I split out what can Web3 add to your audience, but what can Web3 add to you as a developer as well. So player value, I think, is pretty obvious, and it's something that we've talked about a lot in the Web3 space up until now, which is once players make a purchase, that asset is on chain, they can realize value from that purchase, whether that be selling the asset at a later date or being able to hold on to that asset and have the bragging rights around social proof that they've got something that is materially valuable or has some significance within the game experience. The other thing is players can make purchases with confidence. We often see pseudo social proofs in purchases, not just in games, but in a lot of Web2 e-commerce as well, where you're going to a shop front and says, hey, 50 people have bought this before you. That's an artificial social proof that encourages you to make a similar purchase, because you can see that other people have validated that decision and you feel better about the decision because other people have done it before you. Whereas in Web3, that information is all readily available. If you go to the secondary market and see that someone is trading this asset for X value, that's clear social proof that you should probably do the same thing. If that asset isn't being traded, that's clear social proof that you probably shouldn't. And that is something that's really challenging for us as developers, to try and mitigate the fact that we can also have the negative impact of social proof. But the fact that it exists naturally in the space and is provable, we see time and time again drives a lot of value for the audience, and people are willing to spend more because that social proof exists. Players automatically get value of having peer-to-peer economic interactions. This is something that you can integrate into the game experience as a core game mechanics, but also just something that inherently comes with the product. We've got Immutable, a game called Gods Unchained. I think this is one of the perfect examples of how economic interactions can drive value for the game experience. There's nothing within Gods Unchained that allows you to trade assets. You're not in the game. There's no real reason to trade. I don't need character X or character Y or card X or card Y. But because players find value in picking the right cards, figuring out what decks work for them, making sure that they buy or get access to the cards that complement the ones they already have, we create a really deep social engagement system just through the fact that these assets are tradable. In existing products that use collectible card game mechanics as opposed to trading card game mechanics, the difference here being that collectible card games allow you to collect cards on your account. Trading card games are much more like what the experiences we would see in shop fronts in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, even today. And we try and replicate that with Web3, so players can go around and actually work together cooperatively to get access to the right cards and trade cards between themselves, transfers, or on the secondary market. And finally, one thing that adds a lot of player value that we see time and time again with our products as well is that there is a lot of transparency as to game health. Players can very easily see if the game is doing well, if there's an increase in transactions on the secondary market, as an example, or if the opposite is true, if transactions are reducing. And players, because they feel ownership over the product as well by owning assets within the ecosystem, sometimes they can use that as a reason for them to sell their assets to other players. Or, as we see a lot in the Web3 space as well, is that causes them to come and talk to us and give us feedback about how they think they could make it better. And these interactions between developer and player are something that I personally value a lot in Web3, because the incentive models align. There's incentive for the players to have the game grow, and because that obviously adds value to what the assets they have access to, if there's more demand in the market. But also, they're really emotionally tied to these products through the sense of ownership they have over them. So they're much more likely to engage with developers in a really positive, healthy way to try and drive positive outcomes for the product. And that's something that I really value in this space. And on the other side, there's a lot of value for developers. I've already talked about social proof. Whilst that's something that players get a lot of value from, they can make purchases knowing that there is a reason why they should or shouldn't make that purchase. As developers, it's something that we can actually utilize to drive more value from our products. We can create instances using game mechanics that can create the demand for an asset, and then the social proof for that asset is then more desirable in the secondary market. As an example, I can say I'm going to release 5 new characters for my game Guild of Guardians, and one of them is especially useful in the event that I've got live. The event being a new way to engage with the game. So this character has fire arrows as an example, and all of the enemies are icicles. So obviously that's going to be a really good character to use in this game. And because of that, there's much more demand for that character than exists for every other character. And then through that, we can say this character has the social proof of value because there is a reason why everyone wants it. There's a lot of demand. And then we can use that to monetize more copies of that asset or other assets along a similar vein. We've also got greater resistance. I might have mistyped that, but essentially, greater reasons to convert. Apologies. So the users have, again, using this model of social proof, there's more reason for players to make a purchase. Not only do they have the social visibility of why this purchase is viable, they also have less risk. You know, in a Web2 purchase, there's the immediate loss aversion. As I mentioned, these purchases are consumable. If I go and buy 5,000 experience off of the in-game store in a Web2 game, that's it. That's done. My $5 is gone and I can't do anything about it. Whereas in Web3, if I do make that purchase, even in Web2, provided that it's something that adds value or progresses an asset that's on chain, I still have something to show for it. That value is transferring from my wallet into an asset that I can then sell to another user, as an example. So this reduction in loss aversion to the purchasing drives greater conversion in products. And finally, using economic incentives to drive behavior. I've kind of touched on this a bunch. This is the crux of how I do my job. But essentially, because the open economy exists, we can drive user behavior based on economic incentives. And this is something that really opens up so many opportunities in games that we haven't seen previously. As an example, you know, using RuneScape, which I talk about a lot, players used to you can mine iron ore in a game like RuneScape, and it's something it's mundane, and that asset is essentially worthless up until now. So as you get fewer and fewer new players, there's less and less people who are incentivized to mine this low value resource. So you end up having large swaths of your game that produce this resource that aren't actually contributing any meaningful value, that people aren't engaging with that part of the game. So instead, what we can do as developers is say, hey, you know, I'm going to allow you to consume that iron ore. Like some of our top players can now consume a whole bunch of iron ore to upgrade their top end characters. And suddenly you've created an incentive where everyone goes rushing back to produce iron ore in this part of your game because there's now a reason why that asset is valuable and can be consumed. So it's a very loose example that I came up with on the spot just now, but it's just an example of the ways that we can drive user behavior and alter how people are engaging with our game by driving those economic incentives in different ways. So on top of this, I've said a lot of things about why I think Web3 gaming is good. There's also a lot of complexities that come with it that we need to mitigate. And this is why I think the adoption of Web3 gaming as developers is really hard, because you've got to know how to overcome these systems. And at least with the work that we're doing at Immutable, we're trying to come up with the standard playbook of how you can mitigate some of these risks so that developers have less of a problem migrating, because they understand how they should develop things and what different actions they should take to reduce the risk of having your assets be entirely on chain. So I split it down into 3 different sections. So the problems with open game economies, problems with trading, problems with regulation and compliance. I might just touch on the regulation and compliance to start with, because it's the easiest one to get through. The problems are that we don't have an understanding of what is that's probably not even a word, but what is acceptable by governments across the world in the Web3 space. We kind of have to work with a lot of different people to figure out what is the best practice. And we just don't have any set guidelines. This isn't just legally as well with working with state entities, but it's also platforms. iOS and Google, or iOS and Android, Google and Apple have put together some guidelines about how to interact with their stores, but they're very different. They're very arbitrary depending on their own legal counsel, what reduces their risk. And we have platforms like Epic Games that is really open to it, open to Web3 products, and will allow you to do anything as long as it doesn't directly go through their payment flows. And you've got Steam, the biggest platform for PC gaming, that doesn't have any rules, and they just say, if you do anything Web3, we're going to remove you from the store, without explaining what counts as a Web3 interaction. And there's a lot of uncertainty around how we can execute games in Web3 in this space. Ultimately, the only way to solve this is to advocate for what is acceptable in Web3 gaming. And at least what I would advise is, if you're building a Web3 game, have legal consultation wherever possible. You don't want to be stuck in a particularly precarious position if you take an action that then ends up being something that the regulation doesn't allow. So erring on the side of caution is definitely valuable here. But unfortunately for this side, there's no active solution. We've kind of got to all work together to try and drive towards a positive outcome for the space. On the open economies standpoint, it essentially means that we give up control of a large portion of our game to the overall community. In a Web2 game, I can completely control every aspect of resource A, resource B, character A, character B. But once those assets are in the open market, the only way that I can impact their availability is through incentives to consume them out of the economy. So that's a really big problem that a lot of developers have a hard time transitioning towards, because they are used to having complete control over the economy. If they really wanted to, they could just say, all right, we're dividing all of these assets by 10, which is actually a common practice in games as they age, is rebasing the economy. So that's just not feasible when you've got all those resources in the open market. And the other problem with open economies, of course, is that they enable value extraction, which is something that through Web3 gaming, I'm sure a lot of you have seen aspects of this in the media, but Axie Infinity being a good example of players coming in, playing the game purely to take the token that the game produced and sell it to other users. This is a massive problem for open economies, because it essentially just means values being drained out of your economy. And essentially, if that's propping up an asset bubble, sure, that can prop up an asset bubble for a little bit, but bubbles burst, and you've got to deal with that problem as a consequence once that bubble does inevitably burst. So for the solutions for open economies, we do a lot of work figuring out how we can create economies that have sustainable growth and also can mitigate downward spirals of asset values, for example. So again, I've talked about this, but driving behavior through incentives is the most important thing. If you want to add an asset to the secondary market, you have to be 100% sure that there is a strong reason for at least a portion of your player base to go and buy that and then consume it somewhere else. If there's no reason to do that and you're able to produce it indefinitely, the only thing that will happen is supply will go up, demand will not keep up, and everything will crash down to zero, which is obviously not what we want. We want to have sustainable open Web3 economies. What we can do as well is we can create loops that use incentives to drive loops that can allow economically motivated players to take positive actions. So we've talked about value extraction being a problem, which of course it is if it's allowed to fester on its own. But what we can do is we can allow those users who are motivated by these behaviors, and this isn't just sort of your standard value extractors, people from economies that can make actual living wages off of selling your assets. This is other players as well, can be motivated by economic outcomes. I know Peter, the host of the meeting, loves finding ways to buy assets for Guild of Guardians that are low and turn them into assets that are more valuable. So there's a wide range of players who are motivated by the economic outcomes of the product. And what we do is we use those players who are assessing market conditions, and we create loops that allow them to take positive action for the game ecosystem. Examples of what this look like, using Guild of Guardians as an example, is that you can produce assets at any point in time, but the cost to produce those assets increases as the supply of assets increases. So I can make this asset, it might cost me 100 resources to make it today, it might cost me 200 to make it tomorrow, because there's more assets in circulation. But what we do is then those assets have a reason to be consumed. There's a reason why I would want to use that asset to upgrade something else. So as the supply increases, the cost to produce a new asset increases, which disincentivizes new production. The players who want to use those assets will come in and see the price on the secondary market dropping because there's more supply relative to the demand. They'll think, yippee, an opportunity. They'll go and buy those assets that are reducing in price and use them for progressing their gameplay. And you've got a nice little loop there that can sustain an economy in the long term because you've got users acting on both sides of the equation. And also, this is one other thing that we focus on is just preventing low value users from extracting value in that sense. So getting access to the resources that are required for that loop I mentioned previously takes a lot of effort in the game. It also takes, some amount of spend. So what we do is we try and make sure that the people who are economically motivated and who are looking for value out of their actions, we enable those players if they're valuable for the ecosystem. So if they're a spender or if they're a highly skilled player, streamers, people who advocate for the product, all that sort of stuff. So there's a barrier that we keep there to make sure that we don't have millions of users or bots in this instance as well, as a common problem that Web3 games deal with. We put systems in place that disincentivize or reduce the impact that those low value users can have, whilst ensuring the economically motivated users can still participate in the economy. On the trading side as well, this is something that was big news in the gaming space over the years, especially the one that comes to mind is Diablo 3. So I mentioned earlier, Diablo 2 was a game that enabled black market trading. The developers, of course, didn't like that because there was millions of dollars of activity going on outside of their ability to monetize that. So their natural decision was to add an in-game marketplace that allowed players to trade these resources and they could take a portion of the value being traded. This lives in infamy in the game space because it caused massive issues for the game very early on. It destroyed people's enjoyment of the product. It didn't actually drive much value for the game, and they ended up turning it off very, very quickly. But the reason why they turned it off wasn't that trading was the problem. It was the fact that they didn't think about the impact of the way they were enabling trading on the game experience. So thinking about Diablo as an example, for those who aren't aware, Diablo is a character-driven RPG. You have a character, you collect the resources, you collect loot, and you upgrade your character by equipping newer and better loot as you play the game. Now, if that's the reason why you're playing the game is to get the best loot available, what do you think happens to your motivation if you can go to a market and buy the best loot that's available, that will ever be available immediately once you start playing the game? Well, suddenly the interactions with the game become much less meaningful, and you get pretty tired of it pretty quickly. There's no more reason to stick within this game until they release even better gear later down the line. And this is the problem that Diablo had with their open marketplace, and it's something that we need to tackle in Web3 as well. Beyond this, we also have issues with cannibalization of traditional monetization strategies. As I mentioned, being able to get access to assets or buy them on the secondary market means that players can get resources. If, for example, I buy or I earn 5,000 XP scrolls and I put them on the secondary market, someone comes along and buys them. The developer only gets a very small portion of that but clearly the demand was there. Someone wanted to buy these. If they bought it on the secondary market, fine, but we could have sold that to them directly. So that's an impact on our ability to generate revenue from our product because that open market exists. And finally, one of the key problems that trading introduces is the expectation of value growth. We'll talk about this a little bit, but ultimately, asset bubbles are a thing. They're a lot more common in spaces like Web3 gaming, especially with the speculative nature of the space in general. And we really try and avoid asset bubbles as much as possible because the only thing that happens is people get really excited and then really disappointed. So we try and avoid situations like that. So how we mitigate this is primarily the number one in all of the games that we work on at the moment is that we don't make everything tradable. In the example that I shared before about XP scrolls being traded between users, that's a very clear problem with us being able to monetize the game effectively. So XP scrolls is something that we don't actively allow players to trade amongst themselves. That's also a very clear vector for value extraction as well. If I can come in and earn some experience and list it on the market with my bot gets shut down, and I can do that with a new bot. you're going to create economic problems as well. So we limit our Web3 interactions to the products that we think benefit from being tradable on chain. And also we monetize those things differently as well. Being able to sell a XP scroll to a player is something that we use fairly traditional monetization methods for. We create an offer, we showcase the player the value that they're getting, and we ask them to spend money to get that asset. Whereas on chain, we utilize the social proofs that I was talking about earlier to really drive value here. And that's why Web3 monetization is super different from Web 2, because you need to use the aspects of trading. You need to realize that by selling this asset here, someone could then trade it on the secondary market, undermining your ability to sell more of those assets. So then you need the design incentives to consume those assets, or have people hold on to them. So there is room for you to sell more assets into the existing demand with the product. And finally, to remove the expectation of value growth, a lot of the products that we work with, we specifically design assets to depreciate. And what this looks like is, taking the real world examples, we don't try and make many Ferraris. Ferrari is still a depreciating asset, but at a certain point, it theoretically appreciates in value. But if every asset is a Ferrari, then Ferrari suddenly become Toyota Camrys, and Toyota Camrys generally lose value and don't gain value again from point of sale. So we try and design most of our economy, if not all of our economy, to focus on that model of, this asset will be the most valuable when you'll buy it, and you'll extract value from it by using it. And then at a certain point, it has some value remaining that you can then use to sell to another user. This is something that we focus on with marketing strategy, with design intent, with community interaction, because ultimately, the more that we focus on this idea of assets depreciating and assets to be used, the less likely it is that we'll then trigger a speculative asset bubble, which will cause problems for the economy. All right, I've been talking a lot, so let's try and speed through the game examples a little bit, since I've talked about both of these games fairly extensively already through the presentation. But Gods Unchained, as I mentioned before, is a trading card game, and the assets that we have that are on chain are the cards. I've got a couple of examples here of some of the prettier looking ones, but cards are tradable amongst users on our Immutable X blockchain. So what we do with this game is we monetize by releasing new sets periodically. These sometimes introduce new game mechanics as well, but the crux of it is that most users, in order to keep active and engaged with the game, will want to use the latest assets. They want to be able to utilize a new strategy, and will oftentimes design new sets to unseat incumbent strategies that existed for what the previous cards enabled. One thing that Gods Unchained does that's very different to a lot of Web3 products is that we very early on wanted to make sure that we could support low value assets. I don't know if anyone in the chat or in the call has played much Magic the Gathering. It's one of the most well-known trading card games, but 90+% of the cards that you'll open from a Magic the Gathering pack are completely worthless, and so low value that it's not worth taking the time to get in your car and drive it to someone else to sell it. And this is the model that we took with Gods Unchained as well, with the benefit that you don't need to actually get in your car and drive. So the barrier to actually trading these assets is much lower. We do see people trade assets that are worth fractions of a cent, because they want to use these cards in some of the consumptive aspects of the game. If I buy a lot of these, I can turn them into a prettier version, a shinier version. Also, these cards are still useful in your decks. There's a lot of supply relative to demand, so the price is low, but players cannot play just with the top cards. You can't make a deck of cards full of Ferraris. You will not be able to play effectively. You need those lower value cards to participate in the game. And this creates really interesting systems and I think differentiates Gods Unchained very significantly from other games in the market. And how we deal with depreciation in Gods Unchained is, as I mentioned, new cards are able to unseat the incumbent meta. So overall, we expect cards to lose value over time as they become less relevant to the current game. But with how the game works is that there's always strategies and counter strategies. So changes that come with a new set could ultimately make a previous set, maybe from years ago, valuable because it's now able to deal or be more effective within the game's design as it stands at that point in time. So whilst we do say that assets will lose value over time, that can change on an asset-to-asset basis a lot of the time, which I think makes Gods Unchained one of the more interesting examples in the Web3 space, and certainly has been one of the more successful games in the space as well. Moving on to Guild of Guardians. So Guild of Guardians, as you can see in the bottom right, is a character collector RPG. So you collect different characters and you use them in battle to fight other players or NPC enemies. All of the characters in the game can be converted into NFTs, but not all of them are. So we have a Web2 path where players can engage with the game on the mobile app stores, get access to these assets and play this just like a traditional game. The reason why we made that decision was we wanted to open up the game to as many people as possible. And in order to be compliant with Apple's and Google's policies, we needed to be pretty light about how much Web3 we included in the core product. But players can then, even within the game, convert those assets to NFTs, have them appear in their wallet, and then trade them on the secondary market. Guild of Guardians also a lot more complex than Gods Unchained in terms of the kinds of assets that are part of the game. We've got other NFT assets such as guilds, pets, resources that players can acquire. So this is a lot deeper evolution of what Web3 game economies can look like. We're still being very cautious. We still have a lot of things that are Web2 only, but this is our foray into much more complex open economies where assets are more actively traded, and we have to create incentives for all assets to be useful. So the way that we make sure that assets are desired is that players need to collect a wide range of them to play competitively. You could just have one character and level it up all the way, but you can only play really with a team of 5. So that means at minimum you need 5 characters. We drive further demand by having some events that allow you to that require you to use certain kinds. So maybe I can bring all of my fire characters to this one. Maybe I need all my ice characters for the next one. More reason for players to buy and hold large collections of Guardians. We also have incentives, so you get benefits from using characters of the same domains, as an example. So there's a lot of reasons why players should hold these assets and use them frequently. And as I mentioned before, this is something that we've introduced with Guild of Guardians that I'm particularly proud of as well, because it supported us to create a really sustainable game economy. But the cost of production fluctuates, as I mentioned earlier. If you have more supply in the market, prices will be higher. When that supply is consumed by people, then the cost to mint is lower, and we create this really nice sine curve of value in the economy as the actors within the game start arbitraging that market opportunity. It's certainly not on the scale of being able to arbitrage, things like ERC20 tokens, as an example. There's a very small quantity of assets and the margins are small, but the players who are engaged with the game are more than happy to take these actions as they enjoy the outcomes that they get from it. So that is the overview of the games that Immutable has produced in the Web3 space. Hopefully you found that interesting. And now what I want to get into a little bit is where I think Web3 gaming is heading at this point in time. We've talked about Gods Unchained being sort of the first foray into Web3, and I think a very safe bet in the Web3 space as well. Trading card games existed in the real world. They had markets that players could engage with. So creating one of those markets where you can have a slice of the secondary trade makes a lot of sense. And then moving into Guild of Guardians, a game that is much more complex in the Web3 and Web2 economy, and also allowed us to introduce new methods to create those engaging economic loops for users. So where we have been up until now over the years, and I've been in the Web3 space since about 2021, early 2021. So there's much more before this. I know even Immutable produced Web3 games prior to Gods Unchained, but I'll focus on the era of Web3 gaming that I'm most familiar with, which is from 2021 onwards. But these games during that big spike of Web3 in 2021 to early 2022 focused primarily on value. They were trying to figure out how to monetize these audiences as effectively as possible, how they can create the most valuable products for the developers. This led to designs that were just completely unsustainable economically, that the function to drive as much value as possible. Players were motivated to engage with these games because of these unsustainable asset prices, which then leads to the good old positive feedback loop of asset bubbles. For those who aren't aware of economics, essentially, when an asset grows in value, as opposed to a commodity where increasing prices mean decreasing demand, as asset prices increase, people are more likely to demand that asset because it's now more valuable, and they'll be able to exit with greater value than what they entered, and that drives repeat behavior from the audience until there's enough negative action that people start getting afraid that they won't be able to realize as much value, and you have a big crash. So that was just that was what most products in this early age of Web3 gaming were doing. And we saw a lot of users get burned through this as well. People who were no longer interested in the space, or people who were in a really negative mindset about what Web3 gaming could offer, primarily because of the outcomes that they experienced during this really tumultuous time in the space. So where we're at now, as I've mentioned, is we're really bridging the gap between what Web3 game economies can offer to users and what Web2 games are currently offering to players. I think the thing we really want to drive at and we want to produce in this current era of Web3 gaming is a game that players can really enjoy on a fundamental level and can then enhance their experience through engaging with the secondary market and trading assets. That's once we get more games like that, and I will say that I think Guild of Guardians and Gods Unchained both do a pretty good job of that. But once more games enter the space that achieve that outcome, we'll be able to start growing the audience faster and faster. We'll be able to bring users into the Web3 space from Web2 gaming and start having them understand why these games are valuable and interesting for them to engage with. And in the future, that's where I'm probably the most interested, because I can see all of the potential for games that engage much more deeply in the Web3 aspects. For example, games integrating seamlessly with open markets. This is, imagining a game like EVE Online, which is a space game that allows for players to trade throughout the game world. You fly to different space stations, you buy and sell from other users. Having the ability to do that seamlessly using blockchain will enable many, many more games to have those experiences for their end users without the development cost of supporting all of that. Not just from an infrastructure standpoint, but also the initial upfront programming required to make these things a reality. I am particularly excited about having players fulfill different roles within an overall ecosystem economy based on the things that they're interested in engaging with. The example that I always call to when I talk about this is essentially think about farming games. There's lots of games like that. Stardew Valley is a big one, Animal Crossing, Harvest Moon. There's lots of games that allow players to create farms, produce commodities, trade them within the game. And being able to have users who can take this action and produce these resources and then sell those to a person who is going to consume that commodity and turn it into an asset. For example, going to RuneScape that I talked about before, those iron ores that people are now mining much more feverishly than they did previously. That's a subset of users who can really engage with that gameplay, and then they can sell that resource to a user who's engaging in a completely different experience that uses these iron ore to create swords and then engages in combat. You've got subsets of users who essentially have completely different game experiences. And theoretically, with the interoperability of Web3, you could have completely different games where users are engaging with these different systems and interacting on a purely economic level. I'm particularly excited about the potential that exists there. And also just having the ability for us to create economies that are indicative of the real world, or like the better aspects of real world economies. We've creating game systems that allow for recycling, as an example. People being able to consume assets of low value to create higher value assets, having an economy that is stagnant in terms of the number of assets that exist, but those assets are actively traded, consumed, transformed. There's so much potential for how Web3 could drive really interesting game experiences. But we need developers to understand how these economies work, how economics works in general, and then design experiences that make these interactions really fun. And I think that is a little bit away. I think we're still very much in the middle state of finding the games that can broaden the Web3 market. But once we do have the audience for these games in place, I think there's a lot of potential for something really special, and games that can even out endure the games that have existed previously. We've talked about RuneScape, World of Warcraft, and others. These games that sort of grab the cultural zeitgeist, and people are always talking about them. And I think Web3 is best positioned to create experiences that allow that, not just through the game experience itself, but the ability for users, again, to interact with one another inherently through the game economy and create these experiences that are highly memorable. And that's what I'm super excited about. So with that, talked through a whole bunch of stuff. I probably talked through a whole bunch of the things to look forward to as well. I mean, I'll go through it regardless. I did make this slide and I forgot that I made this slide. So interoperability, I just spoke about that in depth, like very excited about how players can interact with one another across different game experiences using Web3. Governance is something that I haven't spoken about a lot. It's something that as a developer, I've avoided like the plague up until now, primarily because if we allow users to govern the overall game experience, they're not game designers and they can't necessarily make the decisions that game designers need to make to ensure the game is fun. Sometimes that's not in the interest of the player base, but we know that overall it's going to create an experience that is more meaningful for those users. However, I think there is a lot of potential for us to utilize systems like governance, not just ERC20 governance that we've talked about a lot in Web3, but being able to own assets, having NFTs that enable you to take control of certain parts of the game economy. Those users can potentially drive supply, drive demand, enable certain actions. These sorts of things I'm pretty keen on trying out in the space over the coming years. This one I spoke about a little bit, but it's something that always warms my heart in Web3 is the value alignment between developers and community. Being a game developer for as many years as I have been, you oftentimes don't have a good relationship with your community. There's even in the happiest communities, the interactions are usually adversarial because if things are happy, you don't need to talk to the community that much. So there's always a bit of tension there. But in Web3, over the years that I've been working on Web3 games, I've had some of the best interactions with game community that I've ever had. And that's because the people that I'm talking to are aligned with the values of the product. We want to succeed as developers because it pays our paychecks. They want to succeed as developers because they have assets within the ecosystem, and they want those assets to be more in demand from a wider audience. So I've done a lot of work with community members to the point where I've had feedback on you could charge more for X, Y, and Z. I've never had a community member say you should charge more for something, but that interaction I think is particularly special. And one thing that I haven't dived into much that I think is potentially interesting is we're still using fairly traditional monetization models in Web3. Even the sales that I talk about where you have to utilize the aspects of the open Web3 economy, the fundamentals of that sales structure are still very much in Web 2. And I think that there's a lot of potential for us to drive brand new ways of monetizing our products that we haven't even thought about yet using the openness of Web 3, whether that be on secondary trading. We try and monetize off royalties, but we know that if you only take a small percentage, you need much more royalties. So that's not necessarily the direction that is sustainable, but I think there's a lot of potential here as well for us to continue exploring as developers as to how we can make sure that our Web3 games are sustainable products as well. We talk about sustainable economies, but we also need to make sure that the product is sustainable as well and value is being generated for the developers so that people are incentivized to continue making these games. And there we have it. That was a lot of information, and I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it really interesting. And I did say if anyone wanted to chime in during the presentation, you could, but I did put in a specific questions tab here as well if anyone had any particular questions. I understand that I'm talking to an Ethereum engineering group, and I said a lot of stuff about video games. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask now. Otherwise, feel free to reach out to myself or Peter, who can pass them on. I'm more than happy to answer questions asynchronously as well, just to make sure that everyone feels like they have walked away with as much knowledge that they didn't have previously as possible.
Yeah. I can see that I was going to say, are there any questions? But David's just written something in the chat. And for those who are watching the video, this is fascinating. Thank you. I'm curious what limits. Actually, David, you've gone on video. Do you want to say your question?
Yeah, I can do. This is a complete troll, right? Because the question is what limits might exist on the integration of game economies with real world economies. And I threw out some really extreme examples just to make the conversation interesting. So, would gaming guilds become DAOs? I think that's actually kind of an interesting thing to do. You could buy your way into a guild. You can cash yourself out of a guild. You can operate within a DAO-like context and in its governance, and they can differentiate themselves by their governance. At what point might players make money to pay rent or buy insulin? What are our limits in actually engaging real world economies to the point that the game becomes part of real life in a very real way? Or when might governments decide to tax in-game winnings or enforce laws in a game context? Because we see this now, right? We see governments trying to play into to push centralization selectively back into decentralized systems when they want certain types of legal controls over the activities in those systems, right? So I don't have the answers to any of those questions. I don't suspect you do either, but I threw it out as food for thought, and I thought you might have an interesting response.
Yeah, 100%. So there's a few questions in there that I'll try and split them out. So going from the bottom up, in terms of government interactions with the Web3 space, like taxing game rewards. To be honest, depending on your jurisdiction, this already exists. Some areas, the rewards that you get from playing Web3 games are considered, income, like just because they meet certain tests in certain jurisdictions. So this is something that already happens. Whether people comply with it or not, it's not for me to say, but it's something that is definitely something that we need to consider. And that's, as at Immutable, at least we have legal counsel who helps us work through a lot of these different things. But as you mentioned, governments getting involved and having an understanding of this. This is why I personally welcome regulation, primarily because it gives guardrails to help other people who aren't able to have the resources to have legal counsel on hand at any given time to understand what constraints they can work within. That to a degree comes through, what is existing in market, what are other products doing. But in Web3 in particular, because we're working with something that's a lot more standard sensitive than what you see in traditional games, I think it is important that we have those guardrails understood. So whether we get there and what time frame we get there, I think it is still important to make sure that we can bring more people into the space. In terms of making value, I like the way that we produce games is we don't focus on this key persona that actively. I don't want to produce a game that is seen as a way to supplement rent or buy medications or anything like that. That's not the key motivation that I think I want people to be coming into my experiences for. I'm still trying to create entertainment products. That being said, however, what I did mention is the availability for certain actors within the space to act as the drivers of the economic loops. I gave the example of Peter coming in and buying low, selling high in the economy. I think there is definitely space for game developers to utilize users motivated by this particular activity, or particular outcome, I should say, to drive positive outcomes for the economy. You're going to get some portion of the audience who does want to take this action, and utilizing them in a way that makes your game economy more sustainable rather than less, getting them to consume low value assets and turn them into something that they can then sell. Like, we want these users essentially to add value to the economy. So finding game mechanics that can enable them to do that can allow players of this persuasion to take action. In terms of integrating with real world economies, I think that I don't see that much of a demand for us bringing real world economies into Web3 as much. But what I can see is Web3 economies becoming much more of a part of the global economy. The reason I say that is because I can't consume oil or corn in my game economy, being that it's entirely digital. But if we're producing products and environments and ecosystems, to use the word metaverse, though I know there's a lot of stigma associated with that, but building experiences that do have much more complex economies, that can then become economies of their own, I think is probably the more likely path forward in that regard. I can definitely see a lot of value there.
So I would add though, James, I mean, to the could you pay for rent? So I don't know, for those watching in Australia, at least, some people are having it very tough. And I could say, so I look at the games that we've got in Immutable platform and try to understand how you could make money out of them and what you could do. And with Guild of Guardians, I reckon you could make $5 to $10 a day every day if you were very active in the marketplace and knew what you were doing. So you'd have to play for about 3 months to understand the marketplace enough. But at that point, you would definitely be able to continually be turning over and making smaller or $5 to $10 US a day. but what that means to you, you know, if you're in Australia, it might mean one thing, and if you're in the Philippines, it might mean something else. But there is also the capital investment side as well, which might not be available to you if you're in a low-cost economy. That's
I
just
was thinking about it. Sorry, Peter. I was thinking about it more from like an esports perspective, right? Because as a games developer, you don't control when one of your games becomes hyper popular. That's a phenomenon that's beyond your direct control. You try to make your games popular, but suddenly one of your games becomes popular enough that esports competitions might arise. And at that point, you do have people making a living off of it because it's a meta phenomenon that's completely outside of the game dynamics. And so you never know when these things might arise, really.
I think that that's definitely true to a degree, but like we're using esports as an example, grassroots esports, which I would attribute to the arcades of the 80s. Games like Street Fighter, Tekken, all these fighting games have very grassroots esports that aren't that as actively driven by the developers. But the big budget esports, League of Legends, Dota, Overwatch, they're all heavily involved. Like the developers are heavily involved with those actions, and the reason why they're big to the degree they are is the developers use them as a loss leader and as a marketing exercise. So in that sense, like yes, the people could be earning real value off of this, but they're more like paid employees who are used to market the game and influence the community versus using it as a separate job. So I think you're probably right there, is that games can drive economic activity and create jobs for people in the instance that they do achieve that level of scale. Just worth noting that it is like influenced heavily by the developers' actions as well.
Cool. Thanks very much.
No worries.
So I know I have a question, but before I dive in, does anyone else have a question? Okay. So in games, as we know, you'll launch a game, suddenly lots of people find out about it, it'll rocket up, and there'll be this massive peak, and then after a month or two or three, maybe your game is used by 1/3, maybe a tenth of the people who are playing it. And so in a Web3 game, you can imagine a lot of, you know, say you've got 100,000 people playing your game, you might have to have enough NFTs available for those 100,000 people. But then when 2 or 3 months later, when you've got, say, 1/10 the number of people playing, the market won't the market get flooded with NFTs? And how do you design I know you talked about consuming and stuff, but I mean, is there a level of consumption, that you can have in that post peak era? How does it all, what are your thoughts on how that should work?
Yeah, it's really handy because ultimately we've got inverse incentives when you've got the asset price. If the asset price is low, there's the incentives much. I will say that the delta between like the expected asset value and the current asset value, like the greater that delta, the more incentive there is to make a purchase. If an asset's worth $10 and the players know it's worth $10, it was worth $10 prior to an exodus of users who have gone on to another experience, as an example. There's like that social proof point, like that point exists of how valuable this asset was, especially if it was very consistent. And that's why I talk about not trying to avoid asset bubbles. The more we can have consistent value in the case that we slip from that, if in the case that we're fluctuating a bit more, it's very clear for the actors that I talked about, the ones who can arbitrage the market, to be like, well, it's a no-brainer. Why wouldn't I buy all of these? Because I know the demand exists for this asset to be at that price. And one thing that I will say as well, that supply and demand isn't the only equation in terms of determining the secondary market value. What we see overwhelmingly is the utility, like how useful this asset is in game, which of course does drive demand. But if we're just thinking about, like there's X users and X supply, we do see that relationship doesn't hold as accurately. As long as the utility is there, price will return to that particular point. So yeah, ultimately it's like, hey, if this was worth $10, it's now worth 1 cent. People will be really strongly incentivized to go and use that because they can see the value they get out of it, and even not, realizable secondary market value, but the game value. I can become much more competitive, or I can beat that boss that I haven't been able to beat by consuming all these really low value assets. Why wouldn't I? And as that incentive reduces, of course, you'll get gradually more and more slowly back towards that equilibrium. But that's why I talk about designing these games with these economic loops, is because even if you stray outside of that equilibrium, the incentives of the game economy drive you back to equilibrium. And that's the important piece of it, I think. If you focus just on assets that are high value, and those high value assets then get overproduced during that period, it becomes really hard to drive that loop, right? Like if this asset was worth $5,000, now it's worth $500. You're only going to have a really small portion of your audience who would be even willing to take action to drive value back towards your previously established equilibrium. But if those assets are, middling value and allow players to engage at a reasonable price with your product, it becomes much easier to get everyone to start taking those actions.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks.
No worries.
Any final questions? All right, did you integrate those extra slides?
Yes.
Now let's move to them. Okay, the merch store is still a happening thing. In fact, I sold another t-shirt last week. It was the cross-chain bridge design t-shirt. All right, and next slide, please. All right, we have so we've got me talking about Forge scripting next week, or in 2 weeks' time. We've got the security vulnerabilities in ZK Snark systems. And then on November the 13th, Raghavendra is going to talk about a new style of app chains coming out of Supra. And then probably as the final talk of the year, I'm going to talk about the overall design space for optimistic and ZK rollups, and try and explore what the various companies have done, what the trade-offs are, and how that all works. Next slide, please. All right, socials and stuff. If you're here today, this talk will be on YouTube in probably later today. If you're watching this on YouTube and you think, I want to ask the speakers some tricky questions, then please dive into that meetup link and RSVP for the next talk. There is a Slack workspace where you can ask tricky questions and discuss the talks and other things, and that's the link. Sometimes there is example code, and you'll find it at that GitHub repo. And that is all. So whilst we've got him here today, any final questions?
Well, thank you very much for having me, Peter.
Not a problem at all. Thank you for doing such an excellent talk. It's been great. I've learned stuff, and I'm sure so has everyone else. So it's all good. All right. Talk to you all later. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.